Hey everyone, we're here with Jack. Didn't record the first time, my bad. And Jack, we're talking about particularism, right? As opposed to generalism. So,
Yeah, so you want me to go over what I was saying before?
yeah, that would be nice. Sorry about that, I didn't record.
Well, I was just saying that, usually the debate between principalists and generalists is a debate between um, robust realists, right? So a
Okay.
robust realist who thinks there are categorical norms, what Mackey calls categorical norms or categorical imperatives, categorical oughts, um,
And how does
or
that
what par
distinguish from normal realists? Because I think a lot of realists believe in, I think a lot of realists believe in, like non-categorical norms as well, right?
So I would think that if you were an error theorist about, let's say, if you were an error theorist about categorical norms, right, you might nonetheless be a realist about value properties. Um,
Oh yeah.
hold on one second. Just going to switch to voice activity because it's going to be kind of cumbersome. So you can push to talk.
All right. Yeah, he seems to have push to talk on, which yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So I mean, like, a lot of people, if you thought there were value properties that existed in some mind independent way, I think a lot of people uh, would consider that a type of realism, but it just wouldn't be. It wouldn't thinking that wouldn't permit you to thinking that there were um, categorical moral facts or something like that. So that's how I'm distinguishing robust realism from, say, moderate or modest realism, right? Because you could be some kind of relativist on moderate realism. Right? You could think um, there's different ways people perceive the moral facts, and no one is right or wrong in how they perceive those things. Right? But the debate is usually one between robust realists, right? So they might say, well, I think that they both agree there are these like robust moral facts, categorical moral facts, but there's a disagreement about whether the correct description of those moral facts is a particularist or a generalist one. Um, they might disagree about whether you can sort of. But there's different ways to frame the thesis. But let's say it's something like uh, that you can sort of reduce something like you can reduce all uh, oughts to a set of useful generalizations. That would be like the generalist thesis, right? And in particularist would just be denying that. So so they might agree. These two robust realists, one is a generalist and one is a particularist. They're going to agree there are these like robust moral facts, but they're just going to say, well, they're all, they can all be sort of subsumed under a set of principles, right? Uh, at least usefully. And a particularist is just going to deny that. Um, So if you weren't a robust realist, it might just sort of be a debate. It might not be like there might not really be anything to debate because somebody might just think, um, well, let's say it's two subjectivists, right? So somebody might think, well, the facts that I'm the my sort of what I take to be the good, right, is reducible to a set of principles of the kind that generalists affirm. Um, and you maybe don't see things that way. You don't. Your morality is not sort of like usefully describable in terms of principle. Um, and so um, there's really no debate to be had. We just because it's not like one of us is wrong about the moral facts and the other is right. Um, so it sort of would be sort of weird to have an argument like that, like to say to somebody, "You should be a generalist," or "You should be a particularist," if you weren't like a robust realist.
Right.
It would be sort of odd. Now, I'm not saying there couldn't be a debate of that kind, but like there's just something sort of on the face of it, like odd about it.
That makes
Um,
sense.
yeah, but now I think that's not maybe the whole story. Well, for one thing, you might want to understand why somebody is a particularist or a generalist,
That's a big
right?
part of it,
Now,
yeah. Because I'm also an anti-realist, so you
right,
know.
yeah. So if you're an anti-realist, you might wonder, well, why be a generalist or a particularist, right?
Right,
Because
that's what I'm
if you're an
curious.
anti-realist, yeah, if you're an anti-realist, it just seems like, well, you have these moral intuitions, right? And then those moral intuitions just sort of like constitute the good or the bad
Yeah, and I
for
guess
you,
I guess just an
right?
assumption I have, based on some of the other anti-realists that I've met, or like the videos that I've watched on YouTube from anti-realists, a lot of them do choose to use like rules and generalist
Right,
ideas
exactly.
to
Right,
describe
right. And
their
I think,
meta ethic, even if they're
yeah,
anti-realists. Yeah.
right. And I think that's sort of interesting because here's a kind of puzzle, right, or potential puzzle. Let's say your moral intuition was that. Let's say you had this intuition. Let's say you were an anti-realist of some kind, and you had this intuition um, that what you take to be the moral facts, right, which are just what guides you, right? Because you don't want to say somebody else has a reason. As an anti-realist, you don't want to say somebody else necessarily has a reason um, to be in conformity with um, the moral norms that you um, take yourself to be beholden to, right? You
Yeah,
might
right.
have the you might have the intuition that those norms are consistent a set of
Yeah,
principles,
you might
right?
also have a preference towards other people following those, but you shouldn't really have an argument that they should, like objectively.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so now let's say then that had you and found yourself in a situation where um, your intuition was that you ought to do something that was out of conformity with a principle that you took yourself to be beholden to, right? Um, well, it just seems like what you have potentially at least is like just a counterexample to the principle, and that sort of shows that um, that the principle doesn't hold, right? Because if all that there are these intuitions, of what's right and what's wrong. And then and so you have this, you have this intuition that some principle holds, and then you find yourself with a contrary intuition that that there's at least an exception. There's a case of something where you feel you ought to do it even though it's out of conformity with that principle. Well, you've got a conflict, right? And so one way to resolve the conflict is just say, well, there's a clear counterexample to the principle, right? And so therefore you should just drop the principle, right? But I think a lot of people have this intuition that they ought to be in conformity to a principle even when they have contrary intuitions in certain cases. And I mean, look, if all that morality consists in is a set of intuitions, as might be the case if you were an anti-realist, then I mean, yeah, I suppose you could just say, well, my intuition that these things should be principles rather than not,
the entire bill
right, will carry some weight.
Intuition.
Say that again?
Oh, I say the entire concept of making principles could be itself an intuition.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. There's something a little bit weird about saying I ought to conform to this principle. But I guess if you had the moral intuition that you ought to conform to this principle, you could just say, well, my intuition that I ought to do that is stronger than my intuition that I ought to behave differently in this case, right? And so then you might just take that other case as just sort of like something that you could dismiss, even I mean, it just seems a little weird to me because I think if in those cases I would just be inclined to think, well, I guess this principle doesn't really hold.
Right, yeah.
But I think people feel a little bit threatened, right? Because they sort of feel like they need to have everything conform to principle. It's almost like that their concept of what it is for there to be a moral fact is that it's the kind of thing that is a generalization, right? And so they would just think that they weren't being moral, even in the this kind of weaker anti-realist sense, if they didn't behave according, at least with a certain class of phenomena that they consider like the moral concerns.
Yeah.
Hard to understand how you differentiate the moral from the non-moral if you're an anti-realist, right? Like that's a puzzle in itself, right?
Yeah.
Like what distinguishes a moral ought from any other kind of ought?
Well,
that you think you're beholden to.
I've seen certain definitions of it where, like, maybe they're overly simplistic, but, like, I think, for example, I don't know if you know him, but Shadow Starshine, who's an anti-realist, has something like that on his blog, where he's like, morality is like where you have such strong positive or negative dispositions towards something, but, like, you also have strong dispositions and feelings over whether or not others should have those same dispositions and feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly does capture something, but it just seems to me that and you could just stipulate that as what you're
Yeah.
just how you're distinguishing the two, right? And that would be fine. You could just use the terminology that way. I think though a lot of people feel like they have duties to oneself
Hmm.
and things like that, right? And so they might think that having a duty to oneself is still so it's not, you don't necessarily think other people have, you don't feel like so strongly about it that you would intervene with respect to other people, right? You wouldn't necessarily be moved to intervene with respect to other people. You might think live and let live, but nonetheless, you feel like you have some kind of moral duty to yourself, right? And so that definition would presumably capture
Yeah.
that concept of moral, right? Um, so, um, so yeah. So the point is simply that, uh, you know, if you thought that, if you had this intuition that moral principles, that if your moral um, intuitions uh, were guiding you to do things that you thought were unprincipled, you might think, oh, well, then you're not being moral,
Hmm.
right? But why not just think that generalism is a false description about what is morally action guiding for you? Hey, and then just give up on this idea that the moral facts that you ought to be guided by are ones that are, you know, basically
I see.
subsumable
So I have a
under
question.
useful generalizations. So,
I have a question. This might sound like naive or like it might be a silly question, but I do want to ask. So, like, when you say you're a particularist, does that mean that you don't think that it's even possible to make rules for your morality, or is it that you just don't?
well, so I think that I sort of came to hold a particularist view, even though I was an anti realist, because I just thought, you know, if you look at how you judge things, right, they're just always going to be all these different, there just always seem to be all these different exceptions. And it doesn't
Yeah.
seem like you can, in my case, I mean, other people might act differently, right? But in my case, it always just seemed like there's different in any context there's going to be different considerations that are brought to bear, and so it seems like the demand for a useful generalization would actually just be contrary, right? In
Right.
the same contrary to my intuition. So
Hmm.
in the same way that I was imagining, and every time I thought I had a principle, there were these exceptions, and so that made me think, well, I guess maybe it's not useful to think about this stuff in terms of principles, right? But I think there's, you know, I think later on it occurred to me that maybe there's a reason to think that evaluative facts be um, can't be uh, correctly describable in a generalist way, even if one is an anti-realist.
Right.
Because my view is that value is something that's actually perceived. Um, it's not projected,
Mm-hmm.
and so all evaluations bottom out in some kind of perception of value, and so I take that those evaluative facts to be non-natural facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I take it,
Well,
what
why
I
not natural? I'm curious.
um, right. Well, I think uh,
Is it the open question?
Well, the open question argument, if it's successful, establishes that there's no analytic identity
Right.
between um, normative facts and say natural facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if you want to understand why there can't be a synthetic identity, I think that's a little bit trickier. Um,
You're saying there can be a synthetic identity?
I don't think there can be a synthetic identity.
Huh.
Um, now, I think one way to see that is that I don't think it would make sense to say that something is law-like under one description and non-law-like under another, right? So
But why would you
I
be
take it
committed
that what.
towards that view? I'm
Sorry,
curious.
go ahead.
Oh, I just don't
Huh?
understand why you'd be committed towards that view. That, so, what did you say? That certain things are normative and certain things aren't? Because wouldn't everything in particularism be normal? Be normative, just with a different value judgment attached?
What I'm saying is that the evaluative aspect of something is not reducible to its natural properties,
Right.
right? So a piece of chocolate cake has a value,
Right.
has these value properties
Yeah.
that suffuse it, let's say,
Right.
but those properties are not reducible to um, any natural facts about the cake,
Okay.
right? So over and above the natural, there are various natural facts about the cake, right?
Yeah.
It has a mass, a color, a, a texture. It's composed of certain chemical elements or certain molecules, right? Those kinds of things.
Right.
It has a certain location in space and
So,
time.
by the way, you believe that taste is like something about the cake, right?
So, uh, well, yeah, I think taste is a perception
Okay.
of some
Is
kind.
that the thing
Yes.
that you got into a discussion with Ask Yourself about, or
Yeah.
am I misremembering?
Oh no, I think I probably talked to him about that at some point. Yeah. Um.
Okay, no,
So
I just remembered you bringing that up. So, oh, but yeah, oh yeah, continue.
yeah. So I mean, I think that when we're talking about normative properties, we're talking about something that's not actually law-like.
Right.
Um. Uh. So I mean, this issues here get kind of complicated. So I'm trying to like sort of seeing if I can try to motivate that in a way without having to go into like very elaborate um, explanations. But um,
Oh, it's okay
but
if you
yeah,
do
it's
need to go into more elaborate explanations. By the way, they might even be interesting.
well, the point is, I mean, one way to think about it is think about so I take the distinction between the normative and the non-normative, what I'm calling the natural, it to be to bottom out in something like the distinction between the first person and third person points of view.
Okay.
And so we can take a first person or third person point of view upon uh, of ourselves, right? So that's the distinction between predicting and intending.
Mm-hmm.
When I predict that I'll do something, I'm taking a third person point of view on myself.
Right.
And when I intend to do something, um, I'm taking a first person point of view on myself. And I think that one crowds out the other,
Right.
right? I think that you can't simultaneously predict and intend to do something. Uh, I think you have to shift from one point of view to the other, right?
Hmm. Right.
Um, so I can't simultaneously intend to go to a party and predict that I'll go to a party, right? And so it's that I think also that this first person and third person distinction extends to the world, to the way we look at the world, right? I can view a piece of cake as something that has these various physical properties. That's to be in the third person perspective. But I can also um, view it as making normative demands upon me, right? Um, I can view it as a desirable or undesirable object, right?
Right.
And I think I have to shift between the different points of view. That I'm not simultaneously inhabiting it and inhabiting both points of view, right? And so I'm taking that fact that they are that one is irreducible to the other to um, to mean that there isn't a synthetic identity. Um, and so I take the third person perspective, the perspective of, let's say, science. I take that
Right.
perspective to be a perspective that views things in terms of laws,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of law-like generalizations, right?
Okay.
Um, that's
Yeah, I see
essentially
what you
what
mean.
science studies,
Yeah,
right?
right. It's systematic.
Yeah, but see, I don't think that the phenomenology of intentionality works in a law-like way.
That makes
Uh,
sense.
yeah, and I think so. There's a number of sort of a number of sort of manifestations of that or ramifications of that idea. So, like, one way to think about it is that when it comes to intentional explanations, when we cite an exception and give an explanation for that exception, it's always post facto or ex post, I guess you could say. Um,
Huh.
it's always ex post. It's always after the fact,
Right.
right? Whereas in science, right, what we're trying to do is discover generalizations such that when there are exceptions, we can specify in advance what the exceptions will be, right? So we can say, yeah, there's a law-like relation such that, you know, a solid in the vicinity of high heat should be expected to melt rapidly, right? Like an ice tray
Right.
full of ice, like the ice in an ice tray placed uh, in the vicinity of a star, right? But obviously, there are going to be cases where um, that generalization is not going to hold, right? Like if there's an insulator, right, placed between the heat source and the object in question, right?
Yeah, I see what you
But the
mean.
point is, in science, we can sort of specify, or at least ideally specify in advance, what um, what what under what conditions the generalization would not be expected to hold, right? Whereas with intentional explanations, it doesn't really seem like we can do that. We can say sort of afterwards, yeah, although I had the desire to do X, I nonetheless didn't do X in this situation for this reason, and then
Yeah.
cite a bunch of reasons, right?
Yeah.
But I can't always predict in advance when I can't sort of itemize all the conditions under which I wouldn't act in accord with that commitment, right?
Mm.
So I think that's going to be one facet of this distinction between uh, the law-like nature of the natural versus the non-law-like nature of the normative. Um, Another way to think about this um, might be in terms of the phenomenology of agency, where if I look at the future in the third personal way, I see it as something describable in law-like terms, right? I think about, what is expected to happen given a set of conditions, and make generalizations based on, this is what happens when these conditions are in place. This is what's expected to happen, right?
Right.
But when I'm in the perspective of agency, the future appears open, not closed, right? So like in the third person, the future is kind of like the past, right? There isn't really there's obviously an epistemic distance. We might know the facts about the past and not know the facts about the future, but we're viewing the future a little bit as though we're viewing it as if it were past, right? Because we're sort of saying, this is the kind of pattern that's expected to hold, right? Just as it has held in the past, right? But when we're actually deliberating, right, we can't actually view the future that way. We have to actually view it as open, right? We're thinking, we're trying to decide what to do. We're thinking, what should I do, right? And what we're doing is we're weighing up the reasons that count in favor of one action, let's say, and counting up the reasons that count against it, and which count in favor of performing some other action, right? And so we're looking at it as if it's not yet decided what we're going to do. What we end up doing depends on what we decide, right?
Yeah.
And that the ability to decide that presupposes that we don't actually know the outcome of the deliberation, that it's in the course of deliberation that we discover what we are going to decide.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think if we think that the normative is non-law-like, then I think it's going to follow that I think at least I don't know if I'm right about this, right? This inference, but I think one reason why we might think that normative facts can't be correctly described in generalist terms is because if there were a relation between the natural facts and the normative facts, such that the normative facts were generalizable, it would imply that normative facts were in fact law-like. And so if we have these sort of arguments that establish them they're not law-like, then maybe that would show that generalism is false about value. So I think that might be a reason why particularism has to be true, even on a kind of non-realist picture.
Right.
So I'm not certain that argument is correct, but I think I'm not sure what's wrong with the reasoning there. So I think that's a good reason to think that generalism can't be right. But I'm
Well,
not sure it really matters that much because, as I say, if you're an anti-realist, it's hard to see somebody who were a particularist what it could mean for them to be mistaken about that.
yeah, I guess the only exception I can really think of is if someone really has like say someone really likes Immanuel Kant's philosophy, but they're just not a realist. Like they could like
Oh,
adopt
well,
his idea as like, an anti-realist philosophy, I guess.
yeah, well, Kant's view, though, is interesting because, well, I don't know that I can really speak about Kant's view per se, so I'm not sure I really understand it. But if you think about Kantian views,
Right.
it seems like those are often. So I take something like Kantian constructivism, right? Um,
Are you okay, Jack? You're whispering.
yeah, I'm in a bookstore, so I can't really talk that loud.
Oh, that's okay.
Um, um, but yeah, if you think about Kantian constructivism, it's um, it's basically just a set of hypothetical norms.
Right.
Um, now, that I think the problem with constructivism is going to be. I think it probably is fair to grant that there are certain um, moral facts, you might say, that are built into agency itself.
Right.
So there's going to be certain commitments that just come with agency, and so therefore they'll be universal. I don't really have a problem with that, and maybe that does pose a problem um, for the argument that I gave before about why morality can't or where value can't be generalist.
Yeah.
But
Because I'm
and
just
I'm not sure I
thinking,
haven't.
well, I mean, imagine if someone, like, for example, is reading, like, Kant's Metaphysics of Morality or whatever the book's called, Metaphysics of Morals. And they're like, I don't agree with any of the claims he made about metaethics, but you know what? I really like his ideas. I really like the categorical imperative. And they just decide to follow that. Now, I feel like that would be systematic.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I think that when it comes to Kantian constructivists, that they've I have the impression they've bitten off more than they can chew
Right.
because they can't really show how certain things are um, derivable from certain commitments are derivable from agency itself. There's usually some kind of I have the impression there's usually like a leap in logic of some kind.
Let's see. Like, have you read
Um,
Christine Korsgaard?
no,
Okay. Have you heard of her?
yeah,
Okay, yeah, she's just like a modern Kantian.
yeah, and her views are the kind of view that I have in mind.
Yeah.
Um, but I kind of feel like it's easy to derive certain commitments from agency itself, right? There's probably a commitment that have to, we all must have in virtue of being agents to
Right.
understanding the external world because if we're trying to realize our desires, we need to know how the external world works in order to fulfill our desires. So therefore, we'll have at least some reason to learn about the external world.
Yeah.
Um, that would be an example of a commitment I think that could be derived from agency. But the problem is that people like Course Guard want to say something that I find very implausible. which is that all these kinds of norms that are generally are like widely um, regarded as important, that you shouldn't torture a child for fun or something, um, can be derivable from rationality itself, or sorry, from agency itself. And I
Right.
find that very implausible. It just seems like there's usually some illicit jump from the fact that I value myself in a certain way, that I should value people like myself in a certain way. That I should value, if I value myself as an agent, that I should value agency in the abstract, and therefore should value all agents as agents, that kind of thing. Now, I can't say with certainty that all um, Kantian constructivists fall into this trap. Maybe somebody avoids it, but I'm just very dubious about it because whenever I've talked to constructivists about how they derive these universal norms, there always does seem to be some kind
Right.
of bad inference um, of that type, some kind of fallacious reasoning. So, um, so that's, you know, until I can't, until I'm proven otherwise.
Hmm.
That's sort of my going assumption, you know, that Kantian constructivists have just bitten off more than they can chew.
I see.
But I'm open to being proven wrong about that.
Well, I just don't know enough about it to prove you wrong personally, but I'm sure if anyone else watches this, they might be able to.
Yeah, it's regrettable because those proposals tend to be very complicated.
Yeah.
They require like a full length book to um, lay out
Yeah,
the
that's
argument,
right.
and I just am so sort of dubious about it that I don't feel like I'm likely to be satisfied. So I just don't really want to spend the time reading a whole book in support of an argument like that. But yeah, if somebody I really trusted was like, no, this person found the way, maybe they could convince me to read the book.
Which person did they speak about? Christine Korsgaard?
No, I'm just saying I don't know of a person. I don't know of anybody that
Oh,
I
you don't
trust
know of
who's
anyone
like,
like that. Okay.
yeah,
Interesting. Well, I guess that makes sense. I'm just thinking if I have any more questions I want to ask you about your view. Um,
okay,
oh yeah, so actually, I don't know much about particularism, but something that I did read, which maybe you can expand on because I did see it a few times, but I wasn't able to find much of a source, is that there's an equivalent to ethical particularism, which is like epistemic particularism.
right.
Does that work similarly? And what do you think about that?
Uh, I I'm not sure because I'm not sure that there are like a lot of epistemic norms.
Right.
Seems like the fundamental epistemic norm is something like we ought to believe what conduces to the truth. Um,
Right.
and so there might be times when that norm is trumped by competing considerations. Right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like there might be times when knowing the truth is um, inimical to some other value like happiness or something.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, well, what conduces to something being true, right? So
Mm-hmm.
um, you might think that more parsimony, that the principle of parsimony is a guide to what's true, right? Like
Right.
Occam's razor or something.
Parsimony is basically Occam's razor, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you might think, given a choice between two explanations, the more parsimonious one should be preferred, all else equal, right?
Right.
But why is it that um, why is that the case, right? Well, there's going to be some sort of probabilistic explanation given, right?
Yeah.
An explanation in terms of probability as to um, why a more parsimonious proposition is more likely true, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Because there's sort of like more ways to get things wrong, um, given the more assumptions you have. So the fewer assumptions you have, the
Right.
more likely. But then that doesn't really seem like a normative claim,
Yeah.
right? It just seems like it's a descriptive claim, a non-normative claim to
It seems like
say
it's
that
a
a
descriptive claim
proposition.
about values, I guess.
The point is that it's a it seems like it's just a non-normative proposition that what is more parsimonious is more likely to be true, right?
Right.
And since the norm in question is that we ought to believe what's more likely to be true, all else equal, then it doesn't seem like Occam's razor is a norm.
Right. Right.
And so I'm just not sure really what epistemic norms there are other than that we ought to believe what's likely to be true. Whereas there are all these things that we use to determine what's likely to be true.
Yeah.
Those things are not normative in themselves,
They're not
like
normative. Okay,
Occam's
that makes
razor,
sense. Right. Right.
right?
Right.
So that's why I'm not sure that epistemic particularism really has any bite, but
Yeah.
it's not really something I've looked into. So it might
Well,
be
I mean,
that I'm
so that might be
overlooking
the only
important
epistemic.
considerations.
That might be the only epistemic norm you believe in, but like, I don't know. I mean, do you have other considerations with epistemic? Like, what's your view on epistemic facts? Do you believe like there are facts about beliefs that are like justified and like not justified?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, I think that um,
Oh, I was just curious on your further views about epistemic facts. Like, I mean, do you believe there are facts like, oh, this belief is justified, that belief is not justified? And in
yes,
this
mm-hmm,
case, justified would be an objective metric. Or maybe it's
that's
not.
right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it would be objective. Yeah,
But you believe that kind of thing exists?
yeah.
Oh, interesting. Because a lot of people would say that. So I guess that makes you an epistemic realist, would you say?
Mm, I don't think so because I think that I think that epistemic realism is usually taken to be the view. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I'm just understanding. Well, I think the term is actually ambiguous, right? Because sometimes it's used to mean the view that knowledge exists, right? I don't think that's what you're talking about. Um,
No, that's not. No.
yeah, so I think another way the term can be used is to mean that there are norms, um, there
I
are
just take it
epistemic
to mean that there are
norms.
epistemic facts which exist.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by an epistemic fact.
Um, well, I'm not sure either because I think there are different. sort of answers as what that would qualify as. But what I take it to mean would be something like, as I mentioned, this belief is justified, that belief is not justified, that there is such a thing as justification, and that certain beliefs, for example, can be justified, or certain, methods of reasoning can be justified, I guess, even.
Well, if that's what you mean by it, then I guess I would call myself an epistemic realist, but I don't
Yeah.
know whether that's a standard usage of the
I don't
term.
know either. That's just one definition of it that I've seen, though. That's probably the only definition of it that I've seen, actually.
Well, I think there's
Because
another
I think the
view.
time I saw the definition was, I think I've mostly seen people talking about such a thing as epistemic realism in the entire context of companions and guilt.
But that's a different view. That's the view that there are norms which are not hypothetical norms um, that guide belief.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's the idea
Well,
that
usually a lot of people, there are a lot of people who are epistemic realists but moral anti-realists, and they basically disagree on the type of epistemic facts. So they say like the only epistemic norms that exist are what's the word, hypothetical ones, and epistemic facts based off of that are also hypothetical. So like, you know, a lot of people would say something like, you should believe what is likely to be true is a fact if they believe in normativity, right?
I think people who think that they're reducible to hypothetical norms are usually classed as anti-realist by the
Maybe
lights of the
so.
people running a companions and guilt argument,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Because the companions and guilt argument is supposed to be an argument that um, queerness considerations about categorical norms are going to be self-defeating because you can't think that epistemic norms are not categorical.
Right, yeah.
Um, and so if you're a realist about there being these categorical epistemic norms, you have no good reason to um, not be a realist about or to reject realism about these like
Indeed,
moral
maybe not. Yeah.
norms. But I wouldn't say I'm an epistemic realist in that sense because I think that the the reason to believe that one has reason to believe true things, if it even if it is a universal fact for all agents that they have such a reason um, to believe things that are likely true. Let's say that doesn't mean it's not a hypothetical norm.
Right.
It could be universal without it being categorical in the Mackey sense. It's an internal reason, you might say, not an
Mm,
external one. It's because we care about realizing our aims or something like that.
that makes sense, yeah.
Or you might have a view, I guess I do have a view like this, that belief is inherently normative, right?
How would that work? I'm
Um,
curious.
the idea is just to say that belief is constitutively truth aimed. What it is
Okay.
to have a belief is to have a truth aimed state of mind, right? But
Okay.
that wouldn't give you,
I can understand
that
that.
would still be an internal reason or something close to that. And so the companions
Interesting.
guilt argument would not work if a view like that were correct.
Yeah, I don't think it would. Yeah.
There would, if you didn't think there was anything epistemically self-defeating about that, then why would somebody need to be a realist about epistemic norms in the sense that they are understanding?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Coder, do you have any questions?
Um, no, no, not right now. Uh, no, no, nothing comes to mind.
Okay, I only asked because you're in the chat too, and I wanted to know what you took of all this. I'm trying to think too. Um, right. Is there anything else further that you want to add, Jack?
No, I think that covers the basic points in
Okay.
response to the questions you asked.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I have anything more that I want to ask, but I do appreciate you kind of explaining why you're a particularist, because
Yeah,
it's not really a view I'd heard of before, but it makes a lot of sense now that you talk about it in an anti-realist concept too. Because yeah, I think a lot of us anti-realists do feel the desire to put things into like sort of systems or something like that, and there just isn't much of a reason to do so.
yeah. Well, I think if you, I mean, I guess the only person who defends particularism that I've really looked at all was Jonathan Dancy.
Okay.
And so if you go to the podcast Philosophy Bites, there's a good short interview with him about it. I think he did more than one interview with Philosophy Bites, but there's one specifically on moral particularism. I think that's very good, and I think there's also an AMA with him that's on the Friction Philosophy channel on YouTube.
Okay.
Um, and so I think you can get some good. I'm sure he's talked. There's probably a lot of interviews with him you could find and other lectures and things um, online. But I'm just saying those are two that I can think of offhand that I think um, give a good sort of. He does a good job of sort of motivating it,
Yeah,
like
probably. Yeah.
why particularism makes sense, right? I think he's very good on that. He
Interesting.
draws analogies with like aesthetic values.
Yeah.
That's one thing that he does.
Well.
So I think he's very good on that topic.
Yeah.
But he's, I
Well.
assume, a realist. So
Huh.
he probably thinks that he's disputing with people who, you know, have this kind of robust view of moral facts and are wrong to think that those facts are reducible to a set of useful principles.
Yeah.
But I think even without being a robust realist, what he has to say is helpful.
Well, that's good. I appreciate the resource.
Yeah.